We tend to put a lot of emphasis on birth order stereotype, saying things like, he's a typical oldest, or you know how the youngest child is. But is there any truth to birth order theory?
It's an age-old theory dating back to the early 1900s, which, if we think about back then, things were very, very different in many aspects of our lifestyle.
A child psychologist weighs in on the latest research and whether or not this should make you parent differently. That's today on Mom Squad. Hi everyone, welcome to Mom Squad. I'm sure you take a look at your kids and you think, well, that one is the typical oldest, or that one is such a middle child. The history of birth order actually started with an Austrian psychiatrist, Alfred Adler. He was the first to explore the idea that birth order impacts personality. According to Adler's theory, the oldest child tends to be more responsible, rule-oriented, more organized, more ambitious. A middle child tends to be more independent, a peacemaker, more outgoing, adaptable, attention-seeking, and competitive. Adler concluded that the middle children have a rebellious streak because they want to stand out from their siblings, and they may have lower self-confidence. Now for your youngest child, Adler says personality traits tend to be outgoing, charming, free-spirited, manipulative, self-centered, risk-taking. Adler's theory takes into account that parents might be less strict with the youngest child. Now let's not forget about the only children out there. Adler says they tend to take on traits similar to oldest siblings. They're mature, independent, high-achieving, perfectionists, sensitive, and self-reliant. Does this sound like your kids? Or maybe you're hearing these traits and you're thinking, this sounds just like me and my siblings. After years of people studying birth order and emphasizing these personality traits, new research is questioning whether birth order really matters. I talked to Dr. Kate Eshelman with the Cleveland Clinic about what the science really shows. Kate, thanks so much for taking the time to talk about this topic. I feel like every family with multiple kids always talks about birth order theory. So I'm very curious, just in general, is birth order theory, is there any truth to it that you think?
There really is not. It's an age-old theory dating back to the early 1900s, which, if we think about back then, things were very, very different in many aspects of our lifestyle. So there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of controversy, but the more recent evidence has shown that in terms of lasting personality traits, there really is not anything to birth order.
So when I'm sitting on the sidelines at a soccer field with my friends, and both of us have 3 kids, and we're sitting there going, oh, well, yeah, we have typical oldest, stereotypical oldest, or even talking about the youngest. Is there any truth to that? Maybe because of parenting?
So when you look at the attributes that are described, there's quite a range of both positive and negative attributes that are assigned to children in each place in birth order. And so I think big picture, it's probably easy to identify or assign some of those traits to all children.
Interesting. Okay, so there's books on this. I know a friend of mine read a book and she studied it and she was able to pick out which child is which, and she said it followed her family's traits. So what about those books that go in depth on birth order? Where are those theories coming from?
Well, I think we also have to look at what is going on in a family's life, right? So it's not hard to see if we have a firstborn child, only child in the home. Parents are obviously younger when they have that child, regardless of whether they're young or not, younger when they have that first child. So a lot of time and attention is paid to that firstborn child to promote their growth and development. Similarly, if there is a short amount of time in between 2 births, you're probably going to parent both of those children pretty similarly because you're in a similar phase of life. Versus if there's a longer period of time in between first and second or any subsequent born children, you may parent those children very differently because you're in a different phase of life, or you may be able to parent them very much the same because the first child is older, so you still have more time and attention to devote to the young child. So it really is looking more at what is going on in a family's life at the time each child is born.
So it's just basically more nurture than nature, is what you're saying.
That's right. That's right.
So then, like for me, I have 3 and all girls. So I feel like when I've heard of these birth order theories, I'm like, oh yeah, that's me exactly. Like there's no one boy or, and I have the 3. So I have the oldest, middle, and youngest. And we always talk about when my oldest was 5, I was handing her a baby. But when my youngest is 5, I'm still putting her on my hip because she's still small enough to pick up, and there's no young baby, newborn, demanding my attention. So how does that play into relying on the oldest for a little bit more responsibility? Is that where we're seeing some of these traits that describe the oldest versus the youngest?
That could be part of it. If we have, and it's important to consider too that each family's home is different, right? So we often talk about the firstborn, the middle child, the baby, but what about when there's just 2 children, right? So how does that play out? But, for a firstborn, there is opportunity for more responsibility, to be more of a helping hand, to have someone else to focus on and help out with, so that is possible. You mentioned, your middle child, your older child, you were handing them a baby. Whereas now with your baby, you might be running out the door to get the older child to soccer or having to focus on homework. So there's just different demands on our time at each of these kind of phases of life when each child is born.
Right. Is this something that parents should be thinking about when they are parenting? Should we be more conscious of how we're treating one child wherever they fall within that family?
I think the goal is to, in general, treat each child the same, but it's also really important. You mentioned nurture earlier, but when we think about our children, nature also plays a role. So kids are born with very different temperament styles as they're developing that personality. So you also want to parent the child that you have. And oftentimes within a family, the kids are very different. So while we want to kind of generally approach them the same, we also need to meet each child where she is.
Right. So personality is playing much more of a role in the way we should be approaching responsibility, and maybe I always think the youngest is the typical wild child. I mean, the way we approach them and their personalities is really more where it comes down to.
It is. And when we think about, because I think oftentimes when we're looking at this, we're thinking about young kids. And when we're thinking about young kids, it's more of a temperament style, and then they develop their personality over time. And again, we're born with our temperament, and then our personality is affected by, events that happen around us. And those can certainly be things within the home. Those can be experiences within the school or major events like a global pandemic. So each of those events can impact a child's development of their personality. And again, that's where you want to meet the child where he or she is.
This is so interesting because you just mentioned younger children, that we're talking about typically younger children when we're talking about birth order and some of these personality traits. But I also think of, I mentioned to you, I'm one of 4. We're all adults. We have our own kids now, but we still attribute certain birth order stereotypes to each other, and as adults we're going, well, of course, because you're the baby, or like, well, you're the oldest, so you need to, like, so even as adults, do we have to see how we approach our siblings in a different way?
Well, I don't know that it impacts how you approach your siblings, right? It may help your understanding of your siblings and their behaviors. But again, I don't think we need to respond or interact in a different way simply based on someone's birth order and or the temperament or personality style that follows.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just the way my mom talked about us and the way we talk about each other, I'm kind of, my view is a little shattered here. I always thought it was because of birth order, the way we are, how we are. When we're starting to see ourselves, whether it's personality or whether we want to believe any of these birth order things, when we start to stereotype kids because of like, oh, well, he's the wild one or she's the responsible one, is there a subconscious way that we are raising our kids with these sort of ingrained stereotypes that we carry?
I think that's possible. I think what we want to be very careful about is that we're not excusing a child's behavior, right? So if someone is a wild one and kind of prone to getting in trouble, do we just write that off to, she's the youngest, she's always been that way? So we don't want to excuse behavior that may not be acceptable. Similarly, the oldest children are often known for kind of being bossy, and in charge. And while those can be positive attributes, we want to make sure that they're interacting with their siblings and with their peers in a kind and respectful way. So we don't want to kind of write off behaviors based on birth order.
Is there an exercise or some sort of way that we can be more introspective that you would recommend as a parent? Let's say we've just kind of written things off as birth order, or written things off as, well, this is how this child is. Is there anything a parent can do to really sit down and be more aware of any sort of bias or stereotype or anything in the way we are approaching parenting our kids and whatever order they come in?
I think it's just important to really look at the situation. I think we look at, and so simply having a certain behavior attribute isn't necessarily problematic, right? So we look for impact on functioning. So if being a wild child is not necessarily problematic unless the child is getting in trouble, they're not doing what is expected or what is needed to be done. And in that case, we want to, again, look at what's going on, what might be contributing to or feeding those behaviors. I think it's also difficult sometimes when parents have a hard time identifying with their child. Well, I was never wild like that, or, I was never that bossy, or whatever it may be. To kind of look at if a parent is having a reaction to a certain attribute or behavior, where is that coming from? And do we need to address the source of that reaction as opposed to the child's behavior itself?
The only thing Dr. Kate Eshelman said that was a scientifically proven trait for older siblings was that they tend to have a higher IQ. Well, after a quick break, we're going to talk about this research and how it plays into our own parenting. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we talked to Dr. Kate Eshelman with the Cleveland Clinic about birth order theory and how science is now showing there's not much truth to it. But do we parent differently based on these stereotypes? Producer Jenny Jordan is joining me now to talk about it. And I know you are one of two.
Yes.
You have a brother. And then
Yes.
in your family, you have a boy and a girl.
Yes.
So, I mean, have you ever looked at you and your sibling and been like, oh, this is so typical, especially since you have a similar dynamic at home?
Yeah, definitely. I think so in a lot of ways. And it's interesting too, because I've gone as far as being like, well, I'm the youngest. I have an older brother, then there's me. But then I'm also like the daughter.
Yeah.
So then I feel like I get a lot of the oldest daughter traits. I mean, I've gone deep into it. It's fun. It's fun to look at and see. I don't take much stock into it as far as it's kind of like, to me, it's like your horoscope signs. I mean, sure, if you look at it this way or that way, you might really start to believe it, but I don't know.
It's so funny though, because I mean, we in our family fall into the very stereotypical, textbook, probably what Dr. Adler was researching back in the day, especially since I have three. So I have an oldest, a middle, and a youngest, and the same gender. So it's not like, I have one that, one boy, and so he's like the oldest boy. So I would think would be what he would be studying. And I don't know, maybe it is I'm trying to fit it all in, but whenever I talk to other families about my oldest, where it's like, oh, well, she's much more responsible, and I feel like when I talk to other families, we all share that the kids have similar traits. So it's just,
yes, yeah.
So is it that we are parenting that way, that we put more responsibility on the oldest, so then they are more responsible?
I think so, and they're going through everything first, right?
Yeah.
So I think too, we remember what they're doing and we look at them because they're so responsible for this age, or look, they can, clean their room now. We never thought they could clean,
Yeah.
And it's not that the younger kids can't do that. It's just they're doing it first. So you think, oh, they're responsible because they're able to do it first.
Yeah.
I wonder that because, and I mean, there's definitely I don't need researchers to tell me, but second kid is just like, sorry, you were second kid.
Yeah, right.
Right, as far as parenting, because
Right.
you're just such, at least I should just speak for myself, but such a nervous Nelly, and so like, you know, everything had to be perfect, and she got the puree with the organic and everything, and second kid got a French fry at age, you know, whatever.
Right. Well, I mean, even in my own family, and I kind of alluded to this in the interview. So I have an older brother, but then I'm the oldest of 3 girls. Then there are 3 of us sisters, and I tend to take on the older traits because there was that dynamic at home. And I always teased my mom. I mean, like, I would be babysitting at such a young age, and I was only allowed to watch like Sesame Street and PBS until like I was like 12, still watching PBS. And then we were joking, like my sister at age 5 was watching Yo MTV Raps. We're like, Bridget was watching MTV, and I'm sitting here like still watching Sesame Street.
But think about it, she was probably watching MTV with you.
Exactly.
So
yes.
that's what I mean,
And
like it does come into play.
Right.
Yeah.
And then even in my own parenting, I had to really take a look. I've done it over the years, not just since this interview, but I have had to take a look at, especially with my oldest, I can tell she feels the burden of the responsibility, because at age 5, I would like hand her a baby and be like, here, can you hold her for a second while I go and do this? But then when my youngest is age 5, I mean, she's still on my hip and I'm carrying her like a baby because I had the free hands. Yeah, she's the baby. And so I always take a look at myself at how am I treating them differently, just based on nature. You know?
I do. I think so too. My son went into kindergarten today, and there was a big sit down with my older daughter saying, "Hey, you got to watch out for your brother. You're basically like, you're responsible for his well-being." No, but you know, it's just like, watch out for him. Can you make sure he's on the bus? Can you know? And but I also told her how lucky we felt that she was there to watch over him, and how lucky he was to have her. So you try to like not make it feel so much pressure. But I do see myself doing that, even though I don't intend to. It happens because of, like you said, nature just comes in.
So now, I mean, have you ever thought about like looking at Jax, the little brother, and thinking about like, how do I give him that same experience of like, you're responsible for your sister in some way or anything like that?
Well, and it's funny because we're talking about birth order right now, but like, it's so funny because my daughter is so much like my husband, like her attitude and her just demeanor, like, is very much like him. And my son is so much like me, like, so he's emotional and I'm emotional, right? And she's more logistical and like, they just process things differently. So I haven't really thought about like the responsibility part of it, but more of, I do tend to like parent them a little bit different because she responds differently and he responds differently. So I try to reach them on their level, as we've learned on Mom Squad, right? Yeah. But I don't know, you know, but then there's also the times where it's just like, the worst thing I do is do your little brother can do it. He's 5. Why can't you do it? You know, or you know, she's doing it. Just leave her alone. You know.
Yeah, that's true. I have to one more story, and then we'll also talk about a couple other things. Not to just make this about me, but I did notice, like with the middle, and I love to tell this story. My epiphany story is when my middle was graduating from. We did a kindergarten program before she went into kindergarten just because of her birthday. So like she was at her preschool, but it was a kindergarten program.
Sure.
And of course, it's like a rainy day. The baby's at home sleeping. The older one's at school already. My husband was actually working from home, and we were like, I don't know, do we both go? Do we not? I don't know, whatever, I'll just go. And I run in, you know, and I realize all the other parents, both parents are there, they have flowers. I'm like running in late, I'm sitting up front. Then they come walking her in with the Toy Story theme song. And I just had this epiphany, I'm like, how did this happen? She's graduating her, I haven't paid any attention to this child.
Oh, yeah.
Like I had that epiphany of like, all the other parents are here with flowers. I'm barely making it. I've barely paid attention to the middle child because I felt like, then I was thinking about it, like the oldest, we're trying to figure it out. It's always like, okay, well, how do we do this? And and it's all the research. Then if you have another one and then another one, then the baby, I'm babying the baby. And the middle is just, she was just out, she had to figure it out on her own because.
But they do. They
And
do figure it out. That's the
she
good
is my
part.
most independent.
Yes.
She is my most laid back. I worry about her the least. And so then I was thinking to myself, as a helicopter parent for one child and then like a totally laid back parent, I'm parenting them differently.
But
and
sure,
it was making me realize like I should stop helicoptering the oldest the way I normally do. So
easier said than done.
Right, it is. It's easier said than done, but it did make me realize like, wow, I'm parenting them differently. And maybe that's why they're turning out the way they are. So
I met your kids. They're turning out good. Yeah. They're doing good.
Fingers crossed.
You guys are doing good at home too. I mean,
it's so interesting. We're gonna have to throw this up on our social pages and just ask everybody like, what's your family dynamic? Do you see the birth order theory with your own kids? Have you felt it as you as an adult, even with your own siblings? Because I feel like we're still talking about, you're such the baby of the family. You don't take it, like.
But it still is. It is still like that for me and my brother. It is still, we're very much in that. And I'd love to hear from big families too, because they say sometimes it starts over. I read that somewhere. Yeah. Like if it's a so many year gap, then it's kind of like they're the firstborn again. So I'd love to hear from like big families too, how that plays out.
It's so funny because when she says like, oh, now the research says birth order is not really a thing, but somehow whether it's nature versus nurture, like I said, I mean, I just wonder how it is that so many people categorize themselves in these stereotypes. So believe it, don't believe it. Like you said, it's like the horoscopes. So we want to hear from you on it. Weigh in. With kids back in the class, the workload for teachers is causing big burnout. Their biggest complaints coming up. As kids start settling into the classroom, a teacher friend told Mom Squad that kids are on their best behavior for the first few weeks, but as the school year goes on, it gets harder. In fact, we're seeing more and more teacher burnout. So let's connect the dots.
Issues like student behavior, distractions in class, low pay, and navigating the complex world of AI are taking a toll on our teachers. According to the Department of Education, just 42% of teachers believe their job is worth the stress. That's down from 75% just 8 years ago. In those reports, teachers cite a sudden rise in student behavior and mental health challenges as the root cause of their burnout. One teacher tells the Wall Street Journal he feels less like a teacher and more like a babysitter. With so many teachers leaving and a lot more burned out, it's impacting how students are learning. Schools now struggle to handle student challenges like learning loss and absenteeism with no clear end in sight. And that is connecting the dots.
On behalf of all the moms here on Mom Squad, a big thank you to all of the teachers out there. My parents are both retired teachers, so I know the work, the energy, the emotions that go into it, and we are all so grateful. And if you missed our show last week, we talked about back-to-school germs, so check out that episode right now. Thanks for joining us on Mom Squad. We'll see you right back here next time.